So I think we're going to get started on time. My name is Cassandra Hemingway. And this is Theron Laysleeper with me. We're the outreach team at the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District. And today we're going to be talking about how to reduce and replace toxins in your home and how to dispose of them correctly and within all the legal guidelines for hazards. A couple quick housekeeping tips. We are the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District. We are a local 19-member municipality, and we're literally a municipality and in Central Vermont. We have been getting folks logging on from all over the world on these webinars, so I just wanted to make sure that people know that we are speaking directly to what's relevant in our region in Central Vermont. But the overall concepts of what we'll be going over are pretty similar, just some of the specifics about disposal might be different depending on where you live. We also have some funding for this webinar through the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture Rural Utility Service. We have a grant that is paying for our staff time and all of our expenses related to developing and offering these webinars. So we thank our funders for that. I think we're ready to get started. I'm just going to talk about a couple quick things, and Theron will hop on, and then we'll start talking about how to reduce and replace toxins. Just wanted to call your attention to, at the bottom of everybody's screen, you should see a Q&A box. Feel free to add questions. There's a lot of material we cover, and we can't go in depth on everything. So if you have any question whatsoever, put it in the Q&A box. We will take a couple breaks between sections to answer one or two questions, and then if we have a lot of questions, we'll have a little session at the end as well. If you have any comments or questions about, you know, the actual like logging into the webinar or any of the other issues that come up, that would go in the chat box. But we'll check both, but we're trying to keep questions in Q&A. Theron, anything else you want to introduce yourself before we start?
Hi, everybody. I'm Theron, and I think we're ready to get going. So let's start out by talking about water systems in general. So when we're thinking about water systems and the things that we put into them, we should remember that water is always recycled. It starts at a source. That's going to be a lake or a reservoir, maybe a river, maybe a well. Then it needs to be filtered and treated. And I'll get into that more a little bit later. It needs to be filtered and treated before it's used by people in businesses. And usually we are introducing some materials or products into that water. Then it needs to be recaptured and recycled and retreated in many cases before it is returned to the source, either where it came from or in another body of water, and then it ultimately ends up in the ocean. So when we're treating water, for example, at a municipal wastewater facility, we are working to remove a number of things, including microbial contaminants. That could be bacteria that might make us sick, inorganic contaminants, which would include minerals or metals or things like that. Pesticides and herbicides are poisonous, and we're trying to make sure that those stay out of our drinking water and the water that we're using. There are also some radioactive contaminants like radon that sometimes show up in water. And there are organic contaminants, which might include human waste or food debris that ends up in that water. Potentially also, I don't know, grass clippings or something like that. So we're trying to take all of those things out of the water before we use it. So that's a little baseline. Now let's get into some of the common contaminants that we see in the water that we use and that we recycle. Cassandra is going to take us through these, and I'll pass it on to her now.
All right, thanks, Theron. Okay, it's really important what Theron was talking about water systems, because everything else we are going to go over today is related to that, and having just a quick understanding of what happens with water when it leaves your house through the drain is really important, because what you put into that drain matters. So we're going to go over some of those common things that are in almost every household, and what happens, what their effects are when they're in the water. So we're going to start with household hazardous waste. This is a different term than hazardous waste. Household hazardous waste is a very specific term that refers to the common toxic materials that we all have, like cleaners that are bleach-based, and that kind of thing. We'll go into the list in a minute, but typically you'll know if you have household hazardous waste if you see these signal words on the label. So one of the things will be emphasizing throughout this presentation is read your labels. I don't know about all of you, but I know for most of my life when I've been buying almost anything, I almost never look at the label. But now I do, because I've learned that if you read the label, you'll know a lot about the product. For one thing, you can see these large signal words on this image to the right. These are actually, I believe that Theron took these photos at his house. So these are just things he had at his house. So he didn't have to look hard or far to find household hazardous waste. And you can see there's the signal word danger is a big one. Danger, corrosive, flammable, toxic, warning. The one word that is not, the caution, is a signal word that means pay attention. It's not as dangerous as danger or warning, but you pay attention if you see the word caution. Because the other thing that the labels will tell you is why, they'll go into detail about why it's dangerous, what the warning is, and you can understand how to protect yourself when using the product. Or if you're looking at the label at the point of purchase, you might want to make a decision not to buy it when you look at these words. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So when we talk about household hazardous waste, these are some examples of the kinds of materials we're talking about. Chemical cleaners are a big piece of what we get when we have our household hazardous waste collections. Automotive fluids, solvents, fuels, acids and bases, and the poisons, the words that end in "-icide", like fungicide, pesticide, herbicide. Those are all designed to kill, and they're poison humans and animals and wildlife. So those are kind of the larger categories, but if you're wondering what in your house is household hazardous waste, think of these categories. And I just want to point out too that when you see this image, a lot of us have these things under our kitchen counter or in the shed or a basement or wherever you keep that stuff. When these materials are brought to us, like when people are done using them and they haven't finished the bottle or it's been sitting around too long and they come to our household hazardous waste collections, we have hired a specialized crew of chemists and trained people who, when they're handling these materials, they put on protective gear. Like in extreme cases, you'll see them in Tyvek suits and gas masks. They don't always wear the ventilators on their face, but a lot of the time they do. And that just is a big signal to me that the people who know what they're doing don't handle these materials without protecting themselves. So that's something to think about if you're going to go and buy this. Pay attention. Do you need to protect your eyes, ears, your mouth, your breathing, your gloves for your hands if you're using the product? Let's go on to the next slide. Yeah, and I mentioned the household hazardous waste collections. That we'll go into that in more detail because that in our area right now is how to properly dispose of these kinds of household hazardous waste. So a little more detail. Chemical cleaners, like I think a lot of bleach-based cleaners, but there's a lot of others. They're designed so that you use them, you wipe them up with a sponge, your cleaning water gets dumped down the toilet or down the drain. So when they get dumped down the drain, remember that whole section that Theron just went through. They go down into either into if you have a septic system, or they go into a wastewater treatment plant where they get treated. But not, as far as we know, and we'll talk about some studies later that have shown that even when they're filtered through, there are trace amounts that end up back, that come through the treatment plant, and they end up back in the groundwater, which ultimately ends up back in your drinking water. So it's really important that you use a minimal amount, if not replace those items. And when you're done, you dispose of them correctly. Don't just dump them down the drain. Poisons. Let's talk about the herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and what those do. And fertilizers are in that category as well. These are things that often you might not dump them down your drain, but you're usually, they can get washed into the water system through rain, through watering your lawn. If they end up on like impervious surfaces like driveways or roads, they'll wash right into the stormwater system, and they will harm plants, animals, humans that they weren't intended for. So they're something that we actually recommend you stay away from if you can. And we will go into more detail about how to reduce your use of these. But these are definitely the kinds of things that you would handle as a household hazardous material. Some of the side effects, you may accidentally kill plants that you don't want to kill with herbicides. Fertilizers actually contribute or cause toxic algal blooms. Some of you might remember last year at Lake Champlain that cyanobacteria was so toxic that it was killing marine life in the lake. It was making it so people couldn't use the water because it was a very, very toxic item, a material that was in the lake, and it happened because there were fertilizers running off into the lake. You can end up killing pollinating insects. I know that there are people who are treating your ash trees right now, for example, because of the emerald ash borer, and there are ways to do that. Like sometimes you need something like a pesticide, but you have to, when you're doing it, keep in mind that you need to do it in a way that's not going to kill other insects like bees or butterflies or moths or other pollinators. And of course, like when you look at this image of the decon, that's something I just don't use anymore because, you know, a mouse that's killed by decon can get eaten by an owl or some other animal and end up killing it right up the food chain. Pets get into it. So those are some of the negative side effects. I mean, if they get into your skin, and you have many ways that these can get into your body. If they touch your skin, it'll absorb into you. If you touch your eye, if you're handling them without gloves and you touch your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your ears, that's entryways into your body. And of course, breathing them in. So they are associated with cancer and other nervous system issues. And then you can see too, herbicides are also can affect your endocrine system, reproduction, you know, pretty serious stuff, cardiovascular system. So we recommend that later on we'll talk about if you have some that you want to get rid of, how to dispose of them. And if you want to think about how to replace them, we have some ideas for you. But ideally, if you do need to use them, at least read the label and understand how to, and be very, very careful when you do. We're going to move on to, yeah, this is just an example of one of the kinds of critters that gets directly affected by uses of the poisons. Personal care products is a really important category when we're talking about the toxins that are common in households. Unfortunately, a lot of the things we put on our bodies are toxic. And if you put something in your shampoo or lotion on your skin, it's absorbing directly into your body. Not all of them are toxic, but we're going to go through a list of ingredients to look through. But these are some of the examples of what we mean when we use the phrase personal care product. Everything from sunscreen to nail polish remover, insect repellent, hair dye is highly toxic, perfumes, cosmetics, anything that you're rubbing onto your skin. And they seem like they're fine because you can go to the drugstore and buy your night cream or whatever, and it's not a big deal. But there actually are some ingredients in there that are associated with serious health problems. And let's go to the next slide and we'll look at a list of some of the ingredients to look out for. But the other thing to keep in mind is even if you don't have you personally aren't having a health effect from your personal care products, when you use them, they do end up in the water system just by you taking your shower or swimming. And then they can harm plant and wildlife. And they go back into the water table and back into your drinking water, ultimately. So in trace amounts, we're not guzzling, gallons of this stuff concentrated, but they end up, going, once they're in the water system, they're circulating. And part of the circulation is, we're ingesting the water and releasing it back into the system. So here's the list of chemicals I was talking about before, and I'm not going to actually say all of them because honestly, I can't even pronounce most of them. But we actually have a handout that when you get your, you'll all get a follow-up email from this webinar. And one of the things that we have in there is a link to where you can just get this list. I think it's a great thing to have just like folded up in your wallet or whatever you pocket. So when you are shopping for body care products, you can look at the ingredients list. The best thing you can do, if the only thing you get from this webinar is to read labels, I think that's a really important thing to get, because when you start realizing what is in the stuff that we think is harmless, it's a little frightening. And these are the top chemicals. There's actually hundreds of them that are problematic, but these are the top ones. There's no law that requires all of the chemicals in personal care products show up on the label. So you might not even see all of the products, but you can see some of them. So if you see any of these, phthalates, parabens, formaldehyde, and so on, these are, I would say, if you want to reduce your use of toxic items or potentially harmful products that go into your body, I would try to find a different alternative. And we're going to teach you how to do that. There are a lot of alternatives out there. Even if you're at like a sort of mainstream drugstore, there's alternatives. They have some alternatives out there. So just this will show up again in the webinar, and you'll get a copy of this in your follow-up email. So just moving on to the next slide. Pharmaceuticals. So this is another category of potentially toxic items that end up in our water systems. And this one I think is the most insidious because our wastewater treatment centers don't treat for pharmaceuticals. And some of it can't be helped. Even if nobody ever flushed pills down the toilet, anyone who's taking a prescription, and that may be all of us, or most of us have some prescription or another, it's, when we go to the bathroom, some trace amounts of that are going into the wastewater treatment center, no matter what. So we're going to go, but you can control what happens with your leftover pills and leftover pharmaceuticals. So when we talk about pharmaceuticals, this is a list of what we mean. It's not just your prescription pills, but it's also over-the-counter medications, like, your cough and cold medicine, all of that stuff. Obviously, antibiotics is on the list, and birth control is a big one. Antibacterial, steroids, painkillers like aspirin, vitamins. That whole category is what we mean when we use the word pharmaceuticals. So the thing about pharmaceuticals is that they are detected in streams, groundwater, and surface water. And we have referenced this. If you want to take a note, again, you'll get a copy of this webinar and you can pay more attention to this source. But if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend you take a look at these articles. It's a little scary because pharmaceuticals are ubiquitous, but it is really good incentive to properly dispose of the ones you're no longer using. But this list here, the steroids, insect repellents, stimulants, there's more. Like some of the other studies I've seen show antibiotics end up found in our water systems. And again, trace amounts, but trace amounts accumulated over time can have a real effect on the population and on wildlife. Just waiting for the next slide. And this is a little bit more about that. They can remain in the water Again, we don't have a system for filtering them out. Even when they go through those wastewater treatment centers, they persist. And we're talking about sort of like a brew of pharmaceuticals, like anything you can imagine someone is taking, trace amounts of that end up in our water. It can cause human hormone imbalances and damage wildlife, marine life. So the best thing we can do is everybody has their medicines they have to take, but the best things we can do is at least keep our leftovers out of the water system. That means don't put them in the trash and don't flush them down the drain. We do have some really great options that you can do to keep the leftover medications out of the wastewater, and Darren will be talking about that in really soon. Lastly, before we go on and talk about disposal options for these things, I just want to explain why landfill leachate is an important topic. So landfill leachate is the liquid that passes through all of the materials in the landfill. So if you imagine anything everyone ever throws away, and even though we have a huge number of landfill banned items that are banned specifically because they have toxic or hazardous ingredients or materials that when they're in a landfill, rainwater and other liquids, can leach out all kinds of hazardous materials. People still put them in the trash and they still end up in the landfill. Even plastics contribute to toxic leachate. So when landfill leachate is tested, this is a list of the kinds of contaminants they find in straight leachate that comes out of the landfill. And of course, the pharmaceuticals from people just throwing them in the trash, all kinds of industrial chemicals and household cleaners, because some people just throw them in the trash. They are banned from the landfill in Vermont, but there are people still trashing them. Steroids, plant and animal sterols. There's also a whole list of chemicals that leach from plastic that end up in leachate too. Leachate is really, really, really toxic. So in Vermont, and I'm imagining in other states as well, a lot of the system that's set up is that the leachate gets treated in municipal wastewater treatment centers. And we happen to I live in Montpelier. Darren and I both work in Montpelier, where our wastewater treatment center here in Montpelier is one of the municipalities that is treating the leachate that comes from, we have one lined landfill in Vermont, in Coventry. That leachate comes and gets treated through our wastewater treatment center. And once it's treated, it goes back into the groundwater and circulates through that water system that Darren talked about earlier. And when that happens, guess what? Eventually it's going to end up back in your drinking water. And the next slide, this is this study. If you're interested in this topic, this study is another one. It's dense reading, but even if you just read the summary, it shows you how even after leachate has been treated, they're finding these same items. And I think the next slide has a more specific list of the kinds of chemicals that are found after landfill leachate is treated. So all the same chemicals that are in the straight concentrated leachate show up after they're treated through a wastewater treatment center in smaller, more trace amounts. But they're there. And some of them are persistent, meaning they don't degrade or go away over time. So, they accumulate. It's just scary stuff. Like, I don't drink the tap water anymore after learning all of this. Because, even treated water can't guarantee that all this stuff gets out of it. You'll see that the levels will look like they're below standard and everything, but, that keeps, these chemicals are straight from the landfill, and they're going through a treatment center and recirculating into the water system. And actually, this is the number one reason we do, I can't speak for Theron, it's the number reason I do what I do, which is do my best to talk to people and train people about how to keep toxic materials out of the landfill, not just these hazardous materials, but even plastics and other items that can be recycled, even food scraps, which contribute to leachate because when they decompose, they turn to liquid, and the liquid leaches stuff through, back into the leachate. So to my mind, the best thing we can do is keep as much as possible out of the landfill, particularly the hazardous items. So let's move on to the next slide, because we did talk about, and this is just a great picture of what leachate looks like. Yeah, this is how landfill leachate is handled. It's pretty much consistent in landfills around that I know of around the country. I can't speak for all of them, but from the studies we've read. So let's see, we don't have any questions right now, so I think we'll just move on to disposal, and Theron's gonna hop on and talk about that.
All right, thanks for that, Cassandra. So yeah, let's talk about some disposal options for these. So as we mentioned, all these things are, if they're not properly disposed of, if they're going down the drain or down the sink or down the toilet, they are ending up in our drinking water. So I wanted to talk to you all about some of the proper ways to dispose of these and dispose of them safely. So for household hazardous waste, remember that's those, excuse me, those materials, those cleaners, those things with the warning words on them. You can bring these materials to one of our household hazardous waste collections if you're in our district towns. If not, you can always bring them to the Chittenden Environmental Depot. And while they're open year round, we only have 5 collections a year currently. So we try to do a collection in each corner of our district. And these are just for our district residents. And you can go online and figure out what town you're in or what district you're in if you just go to our website. But this is how we manage these materials in our district, and each waste district or waste management entity in the state has some method of collecting and getting these materials to where they can be properly handled and neutralized or incinerated or what have you. So the important thing to, excuse me, I'm gonna have a drink. The important thing to remember when you're waiting for one of these events is that this material should be stored properly. You should keep it cool and dry, out of reach of kids and pets. And also you shouldn't keep it anywhere where it might flood. Like if you have a basement and you live right next to a river, you might wanna consider having it up higher. Because if it does flood, or if your basement is prone to flooding, it can end up getting into the water and then poisoning it, as well as any wildlife. So you can find out more about our hazardous waste collections on our website, and we will be sending these recording of this out later so you can see where that is, but it's on our website under hazardous waste. So let's talk about personal care products. These, they don't classify as hazardous waste, and there's not a great way to dispose of them. This is specifically about those ones with the chemicals of emerging concern that Cassandra brought up. The best way to deal with these that we have currently is to just seal them tightly and put them in the trash. And yes, they will ultimately end up in the landfill and probably get squished and then end up in the landfill leachate, which, as you know now, will also end up in the water. So the best thing that we can do to manage this risk is be very careful about the products that we're buying. We can choose non-toxic products, and we can make our own products if we have the time and energy for that. If you're buying products, one of the easiest ways to tell if it's safer is to look for one of these third-party certifications. These are organizations that go through the ingredients lists of products that are made, and they will put their stamp of approval on it if they determine that it doesn't have a lot of toxic things in it. So the first one here is on the left is look for the 0. That's about microplastics, which isn't as relevant anymore because microplastics are banned in the US. The Campaign for Safe Cosmetics obviously concerns itself with cosmetics and beauty products. So you can look for that if you're buying some of those. And then the Environmental Working Group is more of a broad organization, and they review all kinds of things. They do cleaning products, they do skin products, they do sunblocks, and they have a lot of really good information on their website, which we will send the link out to as well. So EWG is that's the Environmental Working Group. And there are more, and you can always just look at the ingredients, and we'll talk a little bit more about selecting later. So for pharmaceuticals, unfortunately, a lot of these have been flushed because people didn't know what to do with them, but there are some very good programs for disposing of these, especially in Vermont. There's the National Drug Takeback Day run by the DEA, and that's usually in April. It's been postponed till October, but there's no need to wait for that specific thing. That's really just a promotional event. There are collection and disposal options year-round. In Vermont, you can bring them to a local police or sheriff's department, local drugstores, hospitals, and then there's also a mail-back program. So there are a lot of options, and I want to take us on a quick field trip to the Vermont Department of Health website, where we can see what that page looks like, and we can see how to order a mail-back envelope. So this is their website. You can see right at the top of the page, there's a link. You can request a free mail-back envelope, and this is a prepaid envelope that you put your medications in. It looks like this right here. Put your medications in it. It's prepaid, and you can mail it back to them, and they will dispose of it properly. It's really easy. You don't even need to leave your house. You can order it online. If you do feel like bringing it to a drop-off site, there's also a map here, and it has a number of locations. You can even put in your zip code, or you can just zoom in on the map. So here in Montpelier, I see there are a number of locations. If you click on it, it'll give you more information. This is the Montpelier Police Department, the Sheriff's Department. There's also the Central Vermont Medical Center, which is up here. And you can really just find all these locations where they have the medication drop boxes. And you can bring your prescriptions and medications there to dispose of. So this is a close-up of that envelope, and I'll show you what the medication drop box looks like as well. So yeah, here in Vermont, like I said, there are a bunch of places, especially in central Vermont. There are a lot of locations. And this is what that take-back box looks like. You might see it in a pharmacy or a hospital or a police department, and you can safely dispose of your prescriptions and medications there. So there's the other thing is that unused drugs and medications are risky to keep around. There is a potential for people wanting to steal things like prescription painkillers, and that's been kind of a problem in a lot of states recently. So the Vermont Department of Health guidance on that is that you should make sure that you store your prescriptions and your medications locked so that people can't access them, especially kids, and also that you should dispose of them as soon as you are no longer using them or no longer need them. So that's the best thing to do with that. And make sure that you are bringing them to one of these locations or using that mailback service. All right. So now we're going to talk more about ways to reduce our consumption and ultimately our outputs of these kinds of toxic things and chemicals. And Cassandra's going to take us away with that one.
Great, thanks, Theron. So our hope is that after proper disposal of some of these items, and the proper disposal is really important because it does keep it out of the landfill at disposal. But then into the future, there are definitely some ways to reduce the amount of hazardous wastes and toxic items that you might otherwise commonly have around your house. So we're going to start with talking about those poisons. And we called that pest control because the poisons are often about things like, mice or rodents or insects or, fungi on your plants. So there are a lot of ways before you ever use a poison. There are a lot of techniques that that you can do to repel or eliminate pests or even just reduce them without having to put poison into the environment. And there is a practice called integrated pest management, and there are actually like exterminators and pest control professionals who use IPM. And so that's one option. If you are going to hire somebody, ask them if they are versed in IPM. That might be a great option if you have a real issue that you need to deal with and it's beyond your control. But there's also like lots of ways to physically manage your conditions. Mechanically, I think was the word I was looking for. Actually, there are natural alternatives. So we're going to talk about a couple of those. And there's an example of something I have running between the walls of my house right now. I'm going to use just plain old regular mouse traps because I have a dog and I don't want him to get into the mouse poison. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so that's an example of a mechanical pest repellent. We're literally talking about something that you can just do without poison. You can have the same effect. It does mean you have to set the traps and empty them out and everything, but that is one way to handle its rodents without having to put poison around, potentially harm pets and wildlife. And also it's a pretty awful experience for the pest too. I mean, I'm sure the trap isn't a great experience either, but it's faster. So this is a great example too of managing conditions. This is a tube and compost system that Theron actually designed and built. He's a very talented builder and designer. And this is hard to see, but this is hardware cloth. And it's a really, hardware cloth is a stiff meshed screen. I think this one here is a 1/2-inch hardware cloth, but you can get different sizes. Like there's, we're having a little Prezi fun. You can get 1/4-inch, 1/2-inch there. It's used in a lot of compost systems. People use it around their houses, over dryer vents and other places like that because it's pretty rodent proof. Rodents can't chew through it. And as you know, they can chew through most things. Other animals also. So this is an example of managing your conditions. If you want to keep animals out of your compost, you can keep most of them out by just really carefully lining your compost bin with hardware cloth. And also another way to manage conditions in the compost is to add browns. So in that example, you could see hay, but a brown might be wood shavings. So you manage your compost in a way that keeps flies away and keeps animals away by making sure that you add 3 times as many like wood shavings or leaves or hay than you do food scraps. Using traps or screens, changing irrigation practices and using mulch to control weeds. One great example I think a lot of gardeners are experiencing I think we're in the window. It started for me a few weeks ago where if you have a fungal disease on your tomatoes, that's pretty common. And it often happens if your tomatoes are planted too close together, if you're watering them in the evening and then the moisture is hanging out on the leaves. If, the condition, there's a lot of conditions that can contribute to getting these fungal diseases that you can manage without having to buy a fungicide. So I know I found myself learning what the early signs were of the fungal disease, which in the case that I was dealing with were just little spots on the leaves. And I would take those leaves off and actually put them into a black plastic trash bag, because just with, that's how I handled that. You can manage your conditions. You also want to keep the plants far enough away so that they're not all crowding into each other and creating an overly moist environment that encourages fungi, and so on. And this is another example, maggot trap. So instead of spraying a pesticide around, there are ways that you can just trap fruit flies and other little pests without having to use poison. And these are things you can get at like the hardware store. They're available they're available locally, and in most stores. You can also buy them online. Okay, so next slide, personal care products. This one is actually, there's a lot of ways to bypass getting the kinds of chemicals that we talked about earlier that show up in personal care products. And the reason why we're showing you these third-party certifications again is because they are a really effective way. And again, Theron mentioned earlier, the third-party certifications aren't, this is not all of them. These are the ones that we're the most aware of. But if, it does mean spending a little time making sure that you have a verified, legitimate third-party certification. To me, these are a really great shortcut. So if you're buying, like say, some sunscreen, and one thing you can do is look on the container and see if you see one of these logos. And if you do, then you know it's been vetted already. That's one way, that's what I really like. The other thing a lot of these do is if you go to these websites, they will have a list of products that don't have certain ingredients in them that they've vetted and they found to be safe to use or safer to use. And of course, check your label. Always check your label. Look at the ingredients and know what you don't want in your product and what you do. A lot of the things that like Theron and I really recommend is looking for ingredients that you recognize. If you have a big list of ingredients that you can't pronounce, then you might want to rethink it. Avoiding perfume products is generally a good idea, just because there are literally hundreds of chemicals in perfumes, and there's no way to know what all of them are. That is why there are so many people who are allergic to chemical scents, because there are some chemicals that have really adverse health effects in them. The other thing that is a really good point, can we just go back to that natural bristle brush? Although microplastics, like the micro beads, are banned in the US, there are a lot of other ways that we can get microplastics into the water system with our personal care products. And this looks like a bath brush. So you can just, like if you're using a plastic brush, it's gonna wear off and put little microplastics into the water system. So like doing things like buying a natural bristle brush for your body care products or for your sink, for your vegetable, whatever, that's another way to keep microplastics out of the water system too. So this is a great example of a label that has only ingredients that you will recognize. I know like one person looked at this and they didn't like that it had palm oil, and that's a really good point. Not everybody is going to buy things with palm oil because there are animals harmed by the production of palm oil. But at least you know what's in there, and you can make your own decision about if it's something you want to put on your body or not. And this actually is a container of Vermont soap from Vermont Soap Company. They're a really great company. They also have low packaging soap, where you can buy soap in bulk without packaging at all, or they just come in cardboard boxes without plastic packaging. And again, here's this list again. We're repeating it because it's really helpful if you at least have an idea. And some of my I keep talking about shortcuts, but I need shortcuts for this because this topic is huge. We're covering a lot of huge topics and we're just barely covering the surface here. So I have my own shortcuts, like for triclosan down here, the second to last. I have learned that pretty much if you see an ingredient that starts with triclosan is a really common one, but I look for the TRI. And if I see that ingredient, then I know that's not one. I can't remember the health effects, but I think it had to do with endocrine systems, that it can have an adverse effect on your endocrine system. Please correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't have that directly in front of me right now, but that's my memory. And then the oxybenzone, I can't even say that one. Anyway, all of this list, this is the list we're going to send you. So if you want to print it out and just have it folded up in your wallet, your purse, your backpack, whatever, it might be a helpful little guide to have to look for those. Those are ingredients we know you really should avoid. So cleaning products, we didn't really go into when you're looking for finding more less toxic, safer, going back to personal care products. We didn't really talk about making your own, but there is a whole world of how to make your own basic things like lotions and salves and things. And you can find really simple recipes and DIY projects online. We didn't really get into that, but that's also the case with cleaners. And it's very similar process. If you want to have lower, safer, less toxic cleaners, you can look at your ingredients, avoid things with the signal words like danger, caution, warning, flammable, corrosive, etc. You can make your own cleaning solutions, and it's actually really simple to make your own cleaning solution. And also, it's really important to know the difference between cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting. And while we're dealing with COVID in this like global pandemic world, that is more important than ever to know. Most of us really just need to clean, but there are times when you do want to sanitize and disinfect, and those are different products and they do different things. So we're just going to move on and talk about that a little bit. But first, talking about just cleaning products. Cleaning is really where you just literally clean the surface and you get the debris off of it. Cleaning is mostly all you need to do for most scenarios. So again, if you're buying a cleaner, look at the label. I mean, you might be really surprised to see that a lot of cleaners are going to tell you to cover your eyes and wear gloves when you use the cleaner. To me, if I have to do that, I don't want it, and this one's, an eye air tendency, it says wear safety glasses and rubber gloves. That's a cleaner. Like, do you really want to have to suit up and protect yourself when you just want to wipe down your kitchen counter or your bathtub? So look for those warning words in the label. Again, if there's a strong chemical or perfume smell, that's a signal that there's a whole host of chemicals that aren't going to show up on the label, that aren't disclosed, and that could be harmful to your health. And if you have cleaners, most of those are household hazardous waste, and you would go through that disposal of, first of all, figuring out what the options are where you live. Most areas of the country now do have household hazardous waste collections that typically happen in the spring, summer, early fall months. But there are peppered all over the Vermont and the US, you will find permanent places where you can bring your household hazardous waste also. So you can start by reading the label, and look at this. This is what adequate ventilation. I had an experience not reading the label on a container of bleach, which how ubiquitous is that? Everybody's got bleach. And I was scrubbing black mold off of a wall, which is horrible stuff. Mold itself is toxic. And I was using straight bleach in an unventilated laundry room. So it was really dumb. I did not have a ventilator on. I didn't use rubber gloves. I was sick for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It's just like, it's very dangerous stuff, and it's important to know how to protect yourself when you're using it or how to avoid it. So again, with cleaning, I find the third-party certifications are my guide. If I'm not making my own cleaner and I'm buying one, I'm going to look for a third-party certification. The ones that I see most commonly around, like Shaw's or some of the big grocery chains or other places where I buy a cleaner, is the Safer Choice. That's an EPA third-party certification, but you might find Eco Logo or Green Seal, and these three you recognize from talking about personal care products, but the EWG also verifies cleaning products. So that is my favorite shortcut. If I'm in a hurry and I just need to get something to clean, the bathroom or whatever, I'm going to look for a third-party certification. These are big. We want you to be able to recognize these logos. They show up pretty small on the label, so you do have to look for them. But that's one way to just, if you're going to buy a product, you can bypass a lot of the really scary toxic stuff by finding something that has one of these third-party certification logos on it. And making your own cleaning solution is pretty simple. If you stock these ingredients in your house, they're all common household ingredients, you'll always be able to put together a cleaner. Obviously, to me, the most common one is just vinegar. I will do a vinegar water solution, and that's how I clean a lot of surfaces. Baking soda is a great ingredient if you have to scrub. I use baking soda and vinegar in the toilet. One thing that really surprised me when I first started getting into making my own cleaners was I learned that I didn't measure it, you can find measurements, but I just shook probably the equivalent of around a half a cup to a cup of baking soda into the toilet for cleaning the toilet, poured in about a cup or two of vinegar. Again, I didn't measure it. It'll have that wonderful reaction it has, and then let it sit for like 10 to 20 minutes. And I forgot about it, came back an hour later, and it had cleaned the toilet. I didn't even have to scrub it. So it is kind of a really effective cleaning solution. The other thing is that a lot of people don't know that hydrogen peroxide can sanitize just the way bleach does. It's a terrific alternative to bleach. If you want to sanitize a surface, you can spray straight hydrogen peroxide on there and let it sit and wipe it down. So I buy the biggest bottles of hydrogen peroxide that I can find because I use those for cleaning, not just surfaces, but also on laundry. They can clean stains that are like bodily fluid stains really well. Like it's non-toxic and it works really well. So I think in a minute we're going to show you a recipe. Lemon is another great ingredient. It just kind of cuts through grease, and having some lemon in a basic cleaning solution makes it just slightly more powerful. And some people will get essential oils, and so like you might have a vinegar, baking soda. Like here's a great recipe. It's very simple. Lemon juice, vinegar, 1 teaspoon liquid soap. That could be like your liquid dish soap or Castile soap, and warm water. And if you want, you add a couple drops of an essential oil, whatever your favorite scent is. I like orange and lavender. Other people have other scents they like. And that just gives it a nice smell when you spray it around. I actually use a little bit of a higher vinegar to water ratio, but it's just as effective. You need a lot less. That's the other thing about cleaners. If you're looking at really reading the labels, you'll find out you need a lot less than you think you do, whether you're using a basic toxic cleaner or a DIY cleaner. You just don't need as much as you think you do. And this scouring powder is very effective. I've used this on my stovetop. I just literally sprinkle the baking soda on top and I'll spray the vinegar over that, or maybe pour it and then I scrub it. And it takes wiping it down a few times to get all the baking soda residue off, but it will scrub all that stuff that sticks to the stovetop off. It's a great scouring powder. It works great if you're cleaning out a sink or something like that too. So we also wanted to talk about COVID because it is a reality that we do have disinfecting and sanitizing needs right now. So just to be clear, when we talked about cleaning, we were talking about cleaning surfaces of debris. Sanitizing is when you're not just cleaning, but it kills, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's over 90% of the germs and bacteria. And then disinfecting kills over 99%. So disinfecting is something you might find in a hospital. It's something occasionally you might need in your household if you have a very sick person or someone who's immune compromised in a very deep way. But typically in a typical household, you'll probably need to sanitize, especially in COVID-19. but you very likely won't need to disinfect unless you have unusual circumstances. But these are the old CDC recommendations that were put out by doctors and scientists who understand global pandemics and public health issues. And they were basically saying to deal with viruses, you essentially just need soap and water. I mean, not only soap and water, but that is a very effective and powerful way to keep yourself safe. And a lot of that has to do with, apparently the virus is often surrounded by a sort of a fatty membrane, and the soap and the warm water burst that membrane, and then the virus dies. So just cleaning with, if you just have a spray bottle or a little bucket with warm water and soap, that's mostly all you need. And of course, I think we're all really familiar with this routine by now. All of the high touch surfaces, doorknobs, light switches, handles, toilets, faucets, etc. But they also had a recipe for making your own sanitizer. And this is actually a disinfectant. And the thing I think is really interesting that I want to call attention to is that you can make this yourself, and it does involve bleach. So bleach does have a place, but just so you're aware, bleach is an asthmagen, meaning it can cause and exacerbate asthma. But you really need a lot less than a lot of people realize you need for a disinfectant. Look at this bleach solution recommended by the CDC. That's 5 tablespoons of bleach for 1 gallon of water. So it's a third a cup of bleach per gallon of water. And if you're just making a small amount for a spray bottle, it's just 4 teaspoons of bleach plus a quart of water. The thing to pay attention to, and the reason why we bolded, is that there is something called a dwell time. So the dwell time is the time that you need, if you want this to actually disinfect, you spray it on and you leave it for 1 minute. That's your dwell time. If you don't leave it for 1 minute, you'll be cleaning really well, but you won't be disinfecting. So spray it, leave it for a minute, come back and wipe it down, and then you've disinfected. The other way you can disinfect is just get rubbing alcohol and spray it directly on. And that'll also, disinfectant is very powerful. It kills up to 99% of the germs and bacteria and all the stuff that are on surfaces. So please do, if you're going to use bleach, pay attention to the fact that you really need, you don't need a lot of it to be effective. Okay, I'm noticing that some questions came in. So, and Theron's going to hop on and talk about some resources. Okay, so we have some questions. Kate wants to know, do fleece clothes create microplastics when they are washed? And the answer is yes, they definitely do. It's recommended, if you're being careful about microplastics, fleece is not a good material to wear. We used to think it was great because it was made out of plastic bottles, and it is kind of cool that they can recycle plastic into clothing. But the reality is it does create all the lint. And if you're running it through the dryer, the lint is going to contain microplastics. And I haven't got one myself, so if anybody knows of one, please throw it up in the chat box. But there are things you can put in your washing machine that will collect the lint from microplastics before. And so you might want to, if you're not using a dryer, if you're hanging up your clothes, you can still kind of get that out so it doesn't end up in the water system. Theron, can you take this question? This is also from Kate.
Yeah.
She's asking, how do you know they are not legitimate third party? I'm not totally sure what this question is. I think it might be getting at how do we determine if a third party certification is legitimate or not?
Well, I would go to their website and do some research, but we have looked into all of the ones that we presented today and determined that they are legitimate. I would also recommend just looking into Environmental Working Group, and they may not have their certificate on everything, but if you're ever in doubt about something, the easiest way to tell if something is a good product or not is to just look at the ingredients list. I'm sure you remember that picture of the soap label. Everything on there was very straightforward, very simple, very understandable, and it seemed like it belonged in there. It didn't seem like there were any weird chemicals that that I didn't understand, and that's what I look for when I'm buying products.
Yeah. So I think it's a really good point.
Certification. You can tell just by looking at the ingredients.
That's a great point. Yeah. I like the third-party certifications because I have a lazy streak and it means someone else has done the work for me. But yeah, you can also do your own. Kate has one more question. It's the only one left in our Q&A box. She asks, referring back to when I spoke about dealing with the fungal and the fungi that had been infecting my tomato plants. I said that what I did was I pulled the leaves off and I put them in a black bag. And she asks, did I do that to kill? She called them the bugs, but I was actually referring to, it's a very common fungi that attacks tomato plants. If anyone grows tomatoes, you know what I'm talking about. You know how the leaves fall off sometimes. Anyway, also I just want to interrupt. Colaco has asked if we will email the slides, and I just want to say yes, we definitely will. You'll all receive an email with a copy of this webinar. So anyway, I use the black bag for the diseased plants. You're welcome, because I do throw them out, and we do have a law in Vermont that bans organics from the landfill. So it's a tough one. There is an exception for invasives like knotweed, etc. We do try to get people to, if you have like a diseased plant or an invasive, to bring it to a commercial scale composter. Like around here, that might be Vermont Compost or Grow Compost, but you'd have to call them ahead of time and make sure they'll even accept that. A lot of times the commercial scale composters they have very specific temperatures their compost piles get to, so they can kill diseases and invasive species and that kind of thing. But sometimes in the case of something like fungi, they persist in the environment if you try to compost them on site. And so I did end up throwing mine in the landfill, which I'm not proud of, but that's how I handled it. But there are other ways. So, and I used that example just to show also that there are some mechanical ways that I'll change how I was my gardening practices for next year to reduce the possibility of having that fungal infection that happens on tomato plants. It usually doesn't affect the actual tomatoes, but a lot of times like leaf drop happens and that kind of thing from that. So I'm not seeing any other questions. So I just want to thank you all for joining us. Theron, do you want to talk about the resource list before we sign off?
Yeah, sure. It is all just links here, and we'll send this out. It's the first one's our website, then there's the prescription takeback website. There's also the EPA Safer Choice website, which is a third-party certification that's from the EPA, and that's definitely one that you can trust. UL, they review a lot of different products, and you can check out their website as well. I mentioned the Environmental Working Group, that's the EWG website. Beat the Microbead is interesting if you want to learn more about microplastics and how to avoid them. And then the last link is the Vermont Health Department page on drinking water if you're curious about that or learning more about how our water systems work. And that's all we have for you today. So unless there are any more questions, we'll wrap it up. And thanks everybody for coming, and good luck disposing of all your materials properly.
Thank you, everybody.